Wrestling is like a soap opera, and because of that, there are always going to be twists and turns with the personal relationships of various performers. But while this can lead to once bitter enemies joining forces after finding common ground together, more often than not, it's a case of one friend turning on another, betraying them right when they likely needed them the most. Of course, with an industry that's been going on for so many decades now, there are many examples of this in action. But which are the most notable of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Backstabbers, wrestling's biggest betrayals. And as always, if we're going to start anywhere, we really should start off with one of the most prominent cases of a partner turning on his teammate. After all, when it comes to Shawn Michaels' heel turn on Marty Jannetty, all you have to say to any wrestling fan is the phrase "Barbershop Window," and they'll instantly know what you're talking about. Of course, this is partially because it hurt worse than others did on account of the fact that prior to the moment itself, the Rockers had been one of the most successful tag teams in the late 80s and early 90s WWF. Yes, as two young, good-looking guys who loved nothing more than to party and wow audiences with their high-flying offense, it wasn't long before they got hugely over as a babyface act. That said, while Marty may have been the better wrestler during those very early days, at a certain point, it became clear that his tag partner was outshining him on every level. And it appears HBK realized this too, because by 1992, feeling like he was now being held back by his friend, he'd decide to take matters into his own hands. And this would see him take part in an interview segment with Jannetty on January 11th, 1992, when against the backdrop of Brutus Beefcake's barbershop-themed talk show, Michaels initially claimed that the year ahead would be a big one for the duo. Following this though, he'd surprise everyone when he delivered a super kick to his partner, then threw him face first through a glass window. Of course, after that, the two were supposed to have a big feud heading into WrestleMania. Unfortunately though, Marty's notorious level of partying behind the scenes would see him turn into such a headache for management that he was fired before the bout could take place. Still, none of this takes away from how impactful the turn was, because not only did it put an end to one of the most successful teams of the era, but it also saw Shawn Michaels begin his rise towards the top of the singles division. And once he got going with that, he'd end up becoming a multiple-time world champion and a contender for greatest of all time, something he may have never achieved if he had not decided to give his partner a close shave on that fateful day. But this was hardly the only time WWE would ever see a high-flying wizard turn on his partner in order to go down the heel route towards superstardom. No, in fact, over 2 decades later, something very similar would happen when Seth Rollins, a man who has often been compared to HBK in the ring, did the unthinkable and broke up the Shield. How did he do this? By laying out Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose with a steel chair, then shacking up with Triple H and the rest of the Authority. And this was a particularly bitter pill for fans to swallow, as it turned out, because prior to that, the Shield had been the best stable WWE had seen since the days of D-Generation X. Yes, despite only having joined the main roster a year and a half prior, perfect booking led to all three men going from relative unknowns to bona fide main event superstars in record time. Of course, while they'd initially come in as heels, by the time it got to June of 2014, the group had become so beloved that they were now a top babyface act. And that was why many assumed there was still plenty of mileage left in them, as they still had a whole host of heel teams to go through. So it only made it all the more shocking when, the night after they defeated Evolution in a no-holds-barred match at June 1st's Extreme Rules, Seth decided he was better off changing allegiances as, after a secret conversation with the Game, he'd choose to throw his hat in with him instead. And boy, did this pay off for him as it turned out, because by WrestleMania the following year, he'd be WWE Champion, though he would have to constantly keep an eye out for Ambrose and Reigns while he was doing so, because neither had forgiven and neither had forgotten. That said, eventually the three would reconcile and come together once more. It's just a shame the same can't be said for another popular team which came a couple of years later then, because in 2016 and 2017, there were few duos more beloved by fans than Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens. Sure, they weren't exactly supposed to be beloved, as they were portrayed as heel foils to the likes of Roman Reigns, but so entertaining was their bromance that even if they usually got the win through dastardly means, audiences came to love them anyway. Yes, during this period, even if the rest of Raw largely sucked, you could always count on KO and Y2J creating at least one memorable moment every Monday night. And when Owens became Universal Champion in the summer of 2016, it only strengthened their friendship and their bond with the audience, as Jericho would go to insane lengths to keep the title around his fellow Canadian's waist. This would change, however, when, in February of 2017, the first ever undisputed champion got a little too overeager when he volunteered KO to challenge Goldberg for the top prize on the Red brand at that month's Fastlane pay-per-view. Of course, seeming to realize he'd overstepped his bounds then, Jericho tried to make things right during the amazing Festival of Friendship segment on the February 13th episode of Raw, where not only would he show his love for KO by putting on a Vegas-worthy show, complete with dancing girls and sparkly outfits, but he'd also get a custom-made painting done of the two of them in the manner of Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. Still, this wasn't enough to win the French-Canadian back over, and so, after giving Jericho a gift of his own, the list of KO, Owens jumped him and left him laying, with this ultimately serving as the rare example of a heel turning heel. And once they realized what had happened, fans were understandably devastated then, as it meant that there would be no more Owens and Jericho bromance segments on weekly TV. That said, at least they got to pay things off at WrestleMania 32, though the placement of that match on the show would end up causing bigger ripples down the line. And it wasn't the only moment which caused major ripples in the wrestling landscape around this same time period either, because while that whole story was playing out on the Red brand, a couple of years later on NXT, DIY would be imploding when Tommaso Ciampa turned on Johnny Gargano. But while the feud which came out of this was a highlight for not only both men, but the Black and Gold brand as a whole, it wasn't as if their tag team run over the years prior had been a failure. No, quite the opposite in fact, because as DIY, Gargano and Ciampa had been able to help revive tag team wrestling under the WWE banner with a series of 5-star classics against the likes of American Alpha and The Revival. In the end, however, after they failed to defeat the Authors of Pain at TakeOver Chicago on May 20th, 2017, the Blackheart decided it was time to go out on his own as, while he and his partner were walking up the entrance ramp in defeat, he'd jump him from behind and ram him into the LED screen at the top of the stage. That said, for as shocking of a moment as this was for NXT fans, they would have to wait a while for the conclusion because, during that very same bout, Ciampa had torn his ACL and so would need to disappear for a while to get surgery. Luckily then, the turn had been so well done that it stayed in people's memories all the way up until the heel returned in January of 2018. And at that point, it was off to the races, as the two had what to this day probably remains the best program the developmental brand has ever done. Hell, you could even argue that it was the best feud in all of wrestling that year, as really, there wasn't much else which could compete with it. Still, for as personal as it got, it couldn't hold a candle to how personal things were when, back in 1994, two siblings collided when Owen Hart kicked his brother's leg out of his leg. That's right. While the mid-90s wasn't exactly the strongest era for WWF, it does at least have the distinction of featuring one of the greatest feuds the company ever saw. And part of the reason it was so good was because the initial turn was played to perfection, with it being carefully built up over a series of weeks and months as baby brother Owen gradually became more and more jealous of Bret's success. So with him already feeling like he was being overshadowed, things would come to a head when, while the two were challenging the Quebecers for the tag team titles at that January's Royal Rumble pay-per-view, the Hitman, being the more experienced of the two, chose to take the lead. Unfortunately though, during this bout he would suffer a kayfabe leg injury, but being the excellence of execution, he insisted on working through it and winning the match himself anyway, with him on multiple occasions refusing to tag Owen in. Needless to say, however, even Bret would be unable to overcome the odds stacked against him with this injury, and so, after just over 16 minutes, the referee had no choice but to stop the match and award it to the heel champions. Of course, this only infuriated the youngest Hart even more, as, had his brother given him the ball, he was sure he could have won the match for his team. As this had not happened though, he would instead get in the ring with Bret after things were over and kick him in his injured leg to formally sever their union. And that led to two of the greatest bouts in WWE history later that year then, their singles contest at WrestleMania 10 and the Steel Cage rematch at SummerSlam a few months later. Yes, even if fans did have to see a pair of siblings fall apart in order to get there, at least they were rewarded with something special as a result of this. Unfortunately though, the same can't be said for another feud which came a couple of decades later as, despite being sisters, when Nikki Bella turned on Brie in 2014, it just didn't have the same long-term impact. But then, it was never going to, because as popular as they may have been with a certain section of the audience, the Bella twins were never known for being able to put on great wrestling matches. So even if the initial turn had been carried out to perfection, then it was never going to get the payoff it deserved, as with this being a wrestling show and things usually being settled inside of a wrestling ring, the pair just weren't up to the task. And maybe that's why it was for the best then that a great turn wasn't wasted here then. No, despite having been pretty much joined at the hip for most of the run up until that point, when they did eventually split, not many people seemed to care. What was the reason for this? Well, the way it was carried out didn't make a huge amount of sense as it happened. And that's because rather than teasing it and building it up for a while, the whole thing would just apparently come out of nowhere when, during Brie's big singles bout with Stephanie McMahon at that August SummerSlam, Mrs. Daniel Bryan was screwed out of the victory when her sister attacked her and handed the billion-dollar princess the clear advantage. That said, while it wasn't the best executed turn, it could have still been salvaged if what came next was any good. So it's a shame that what came next was even worse because just a few weeks later in a now infamous segment hosted by Jerry Springer on the September 8th episode of Raw, Nikki explained her betrayal by saying that she'd always hated Brie and that she wished she died in the womb. Yeah, it was pretty lame, and the eventual payoff wouldn't be much better either, as after ending up being forced to serve as her sister's personal assistant for 30 days, Brie would end up just turning heel and siding with the by then Divas champion again, with there never really being any real explanation as to why this had happened. So maybe it just goes to show that, the hearts aside, sometimes WWE shouldn't go with the warring siblings storyline. After all, it wasn't like it worked out any better for another set of brothers in 2009 when, at that January's Royal Rumble, Matt Hardy turned on his own family member, Jeff. And to make this one even worse, it wasn't as if it was the first time WWE had tried to separate the two either, as way back in late 2001, they'd already been teasing dissension among the ranks. But while at that point, Vince McMahon realized no one wanted to see the Hardys feud and so he quickly scrapped the whole thing, the idea clearly remained in the back of his mind, enough to where 8 years later, he'd try again when he had version 1 lay out the charismatic Enigma with a steel chair. Why had he done this? Well, after losing an ECW World title match against Jack Swagger, Matt felt like he needed to reinvigorate himself. And his method of doing so was to shed what he felt was the dead weight of his own flesh and blood and come out stronger on the other side of this. Of course, in doing that, he would also end up costing Jeff his WWE title bout with Edge, and so after he came to and realized what happened, Jeff immediately set about getting his revenge, with this all leading to him having a series of showdowns with Matt over the months which followed. But that wasn't the only reason they wanted to fight, because throughout this period, Matt continued to make matters worse for himself when he implied he'd been responsible for all the bad things which had happened to his brother over the prior year, with these including an automobile accident he'd been involved in, a pyrotechnics malfunction at a WWE show, and even the death of his beloved dog. So, with it being clear that version 1 was going full cartoon villain for this one, it only made sense he'd eventually fall once and for all in equally a dramatic a fashion when, during an I Quit match at that April's Backlash, he'd not only be beaten by his younger half, but he'd legitimately break his hand in the process. And with that injury, the feud between the Hardys came to a merciful end as, with it once again becoming clear no one really wanted to see them fight, Vince McMahon split them apart and put them on different rosters where they would remain until Matt was fired the following year. Then when they returned to New York later that decade, they'd be a unit once more, with no reference to their prior beef ever being acknowledged. But not all betrayals and subsequent feuds have flopped to the point that they effectively had to be retconned out of existence in company canon because, on more than one occasion, a figure turning on one of his allies has led to a moment so game-changing it altered the course of wrestling forever in a good way. And there are few better examples of this being the case than the time when, in 1996, following years of standing by his side, Paul Bearer would turn his back on The Undertaker. Of course, what made this one so shocking was the fact that absolutely no one saw it coming. After all, the duo had been so closely intertwined since the early 90s that it seemed unthinkable to have one without the other. Obviously, Bearer didn't agree with this sentiment, however, because at that year's SummerSlam, he'd lay out the dead man with his own urn at the close of his Boiler Room brawl with Mankind, then align himself with the heel going forward from there. Not that the incident marked the end of the two's relationship though, because following this, the former WWF champion continued a feud with his now former manager for much of the next year. And when in 1997 he became the WWF champion for a second time, Bearer would be right there trying to weasel his way back into his good graces as he realized that there was still money to be made on the Phenom. That said, had he not betrayed his client in the first place, then he would have never had to make these amends at all. And even though they would eventually reconcile, the dead man apparently never forgot about what happened all those years previous, as in 2004, he'd finally get his revenge when he wrote Bearer off of TV for good by burying him 6 feet under in cement. But for as dramatic of an act of revenge as this was, it felt fitting given the almost mythical nature of the characters involved. If, however, you're looking for a betrayal which was a lot more rooted in the real world, then you can't go wrong by traveling back to the very same year Paul Bearer was kayfabe killed, as while that was happening on SmackDown, over on Raw, Evolution was giving Randy Orton the thumbs down. Yes, despite the fact that the four-man group had seemed like an unstoppable force for much of the year prior, it always felt like it was only a matter of time until they ended up going their separate ways. After all, with Orton and Batista clearly being positioned as the two up-and-coming future superstars of the stable, there was inevitably going to be a point where they threatened to usurp Triple H. And given how much the game craved the spotlight for himself, he wasn't going to give this up easily. So when the Legend Killer rose to the top first by beating Chris Benoit for the World Heavyweight title at that August SummerSlam, the rest of his allies didn't take too kindly to this fact. No, realizing that he was now outgrowing them, they'd all come together in private to make a decision about his future. And this decision would be made clear for everyone to see the following night on Raw when, while Orton was hoisted up on the shoulders of the Animal during a championship victory celebration, Triple H, like a Roman emperor of old, delivered a thumbs down so as to signal that his protege's time in Evolution was up. And after that, as all three put the boots to their now former friend, the Viper would be, for the first time in a long time, all on his own, with no one to back him up and no one to help him out when he needed it the most. So it should come as no surprise that he soon lost the World Heavyweight title to his former mentor following this. Of course, even that wasn't the biggest betrayal Triple H was involved in during his career though, because years prior, in December of 1999, he'd be right there in the middle of the ring when Stephanie McMahon went to the dark side by turning on her father, Vince. But wait, what was happening here? Well, in the winter of that year, a storyline had taken place where Triple H had gotten Stephanie drunk in Las Vegas and proceeded to marry her in a shotgun wedding. Needless to say then, initially the billion-dollar princess would be devastated by this as she had hoped to marry her then kayfabe boyfriend Test instead. And so, in order to secure a divorce for his beloved daughter, Vince McMahon challenged the game to a fight at December's Armageddon pay-per-view, with the stipulation here being that, if he won, the marriage would be annulled. What he didn't realize at the time, however, was that this was all part of Stephanie's plan, as right when the boss looked to have things won, his daughter would stop him from using a sledgehammer as a weapon and instead allow her husband to use it while his back was turned. After that, once the King of Kings secured the win, he'd embrace his wife in the middle of the ring as the two revealed they'd been working together all along. But why the subterfuge? Well, given how poorly Stephanie had been treated by her dad earlier that year when he was having her sacrificed to the Undertaker in a dark wedding, she decided that she would bide her time so as to get the ultimate revenge. And this revenge would see her pierce her father's heart so deeply with her betrayal that, the next night on Raw, he'd take a temporary leave of absence from the WWF, leaving Triple H and Stephanie to run the show in his place as the McMahon-Helmsley era began. Of course, in more recent years, life has imitated art, as when Vince left WWE, it would be the McMahon-Helmsley era which picked up the slack all over again, because now Triple H serves as the head of creative for the entire company, all while Stephanie stands alongside Nick Khan as the CEO in the business side of things. So, with them in charge of the show going forward and the creative direction improving somewhat, we wouldn't be surprised if there weren't more backstabbings and betrayals to come in the future. After all, as we've seen today, it's a storyline which always works when done correctly. And given how much of an expert the game seems to be at betraying others on screen, he should know exactly how to make it work the next time around.